So this is a webinar hosted by the UU Ministers Association on ministering to youth and young adults of color, and we're going to focus on faith formation and spiritual renewal. I'm Reverend Elizabeth Nguyen. I serve our Unitarian Universalist Association as the Leadership Development Associate for Youth and Young Adults of Color. Just a little more about me. I was raised as a UU in the Midwest and in the South. I'm second generation Vietnamese American, Irish and German on my mother's side. And my father immigrated here to Milwaukee, Wisconsin after the end of the Vietnam War. I live in Boston, and we are very happy that there's sun and it feels a little bit like spring. So it's good to be with you all. So I want to start with some words to ground us by the Unitarian poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And maybe just before we do that, Allison, if you want to go to the next slide, if anyone's having struggles with Zoom, here are a few tips. And Reverend Allison Palm, who's supporting us on technology, is brilliant at this stuff. So feel free to chat her if you are having a struggle. Awesome. All right, let's go to these words. These are from a poem she wrote called Songs for the People. Let me make songs for the people, songs for the old and young, songs to stir like a battle cry wherever they are sung. Let me make the songs for the weary amid life's fever and fret, till hearts shall relax their tension and careworn brows forget. Our world so worn and weary needs music pure and strong to hush the jangle and discords of sorrow, pain, and wrong. So thank you. So I want to start with a story before we dive into some of the insights and frameworks that I want to share with you all. There's a young person that I know named Mary. She grew up in Ethiopia and immigrated to this country. She's 16 now. And over the past year, she's become a really amazing community organizer after the non-indictments of the police who shot and killed Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. She organized a 400-person walkout of her high school. She facilitated community conversations with police and youth. She organized a direct action at the Massachusetts State House. And as part of all of that amazing work, she ended up receiving the Courageous Love Award from the UU Church where she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And her family is Ethiopian Orthodox. And she took her mother to the UU Church to receive this Courageous Love Award. And she told me after that her mother was totally confused because she couldn't find a Bible anywhere in the church. But that Mary picked up a hymnal, was paging through it, and was blown away to find words by Martin Luther King, by Alice Walker, by Maya Angelou, by Audre Lorde. And she came up to me later and she said, I feel like this might be the church where I want to be, that this could be the church for me. And I share that story because I feel like this is where we so often find ourselves as Unitarian Universalists, feeling really committed to building beloved, multicultural, multiracial community, really committed to creating cultures that resist oppression, resist perpetuating harmful systems like racism. And we also know that because of systems that we didn't create, but that we are very much part of, people like Mary, who are seekers, who are youth of color, and people like myself as a young adult of color who grew up UU, find ourselves both very nourished by Unitarian Universalism, but also often heartbroken by it. So over the next half hour, I'm just going to share some of the insights and frameworks that have been really helpful to me as a religious professional and that resonate with my own experience as someone who grew up as a youth of color in our movement and now as a young adult and a religious professional. So we'll do that until about 4:30, maybe a little after, and then we'll transition to a time where folks can share wisdom, best practices, can talk through challenges, and we can really try to support each other in what is challenging and really life-giving work. And I just want to say really briefly that I am going to generalize because this webinar would be impossible if I qualified everything I said. So I'm going to make generalizations, and many of the things that I say may not be true in every particular context. Will in fact not be true in every particular context. All right, so I want to share 5 insights or frameworks that have been really helpful to me. So maybe we can go to that slide. So the first one is to be real about where we are. And I want to share a few things that came out of the recent Multicultural Ministry Sharing Project, where a number of Unitarian Universalists, including youth and young adults, were surveyed about their experience of Unitarian Universalism. So next slide, I think I'll show. So this is some data from that project. And the takeaways are pretty heartbreaking in some ways, that many Unitarian Universalists of color report that their spiritual needs were mostly unmet by their congregations. Many youths of color report feeling invisible in their communities, being tokenized. You can see about half report feeling like they're the only person like them in their UU community, or report having had people make comments that were unintentionally very painful. And this is where we are. I remember being a kid in a UU congregation and having people out of no intention, no bad intention, assume that my brother and I were adopted because we look Asian and have Asian last names, and my mother is white, and she was the person who was most often with us in our congregational context. And the impact of that was that we felt like we weren't seen for who we were, that people didn't understand our story. So that is part of what's real, and in order to move forward, we need to know what's real. And in some ways, this webinar is a little funny because I personally don't think we will ever fully be able to serve all UU youth and young adults of color as long as we exist in a context of society which is racist. So I think what we're here to do is figure out how we can move from where we are given all that is broken out there in the world. But there is some really good news, at least in my sense, which is that we all have a role in supporting UU youth and young adults of color. And we can all do that work really powerfully, whether we're religious educators or youth advisors or ministers or in some other leadership role. So that's a little bit about where we are. The next insight that I want to lift up is that we can ask, and I wrote ask the right questions, and I realize I don't even really want to say that. What I want to say is we can ask better questions. I heard the religious educator Mark Hicks talk a while back about how when we talk about building beloved multicultural, multiracial community, we often focus on how we can support white people to connect across difference and how we can support white people to be uncomfortable through challenging conversations. And his insight, which very much resonated with me, is that we have to center Unitarian Universalists of color's experiences. And we have to begin asking or keep asking, what do Unitarian Universalists of color need to have fulfilling, nourishing spiritual lives and spiritual community? So that is a key question that I want to share with you all. And that question can be asked in a multitude of contexts. I know when I'm writing a prayer or a meditation or designing a curriculum, there's always some questions in my head. What is here for people of different ages? What is here for atheists? What is here for humanists? What is here for people of different learning styles? And we need to add to that, what is here for a UU youth or a young adult of color, whether or not that person is in the room. And if we ask that question, that can fundamentally change how we spend our time, what we prioritize, and even how we talk. Sometimes when we talk about race and racism, we often unintentionally imagine our audience to be totally white. And this can be very subtle and very implicit. And it's not, what do I want to say? In some ways, of course, because we live in a society that teaches us to do that. So it's not on us as individuals. It's part of a system that we're caught in. So, sometimes we say things like, we really need to confront our privilege. And when we say things like that, we may not realize that that can make UU youth and young adults of color feel invisible, because they may feel like, oh, I don't need to confront my privilege. I need to develop a stronger and more rooted identity as a person of color. But confronting my privilege in this moment isn't my work. And sometimes it may be even fuzzier. We may talk about wanting to connect to diverse communities. And when we say that, we may imagine a we that is not multiracial. And in doing so, that may also make UU youth and young adults of color feel like they don't belong or like they're not visible and present. And I think, go to the next slide. We can bring that question to worship, cons, what youth group looks like, what campus ministry looks like. And let's see, let's go to the next slide. And when we talk specifically about youth ministry, just to zoom in a little, this is a framework that talks about sort of the different pieces of healthy youth ministry. We can bring that question to each of those pieces. So what is here that would support a youth of color being pastorally cared for? What is here that supports the covenantal leadership development of a UU youth of color? And to zoom in on spiritual development, what is here that would support a UU youth of color's spiritual development? So if I take that question seriously, it might lead me to realize that I need to incorporate more stories of Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists of color into whatever I'm doing. It might mean that I then prioritize booking out 2 hours to figure out how to tell the story of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in a dynamic way with puppets or glitter or music or whatever, because I realize that it's really important to have ancestors of color lifted up. It might mean that I decide that the next time I'm leading worship for youth, we take up ancestors and we do a ritual where people bring an object that represents an ancestor that's important to them and have people share in candlelight one thing about that ancestor that makes them feel proud, as a way to invite people into sharing about where they come from and their identities. It might mean that I decide to lead a walking meditation to music by an artist of color who is talking about identity and justice. And something that has shifted for me is not only do I need to be asking this question, what is here for you, youth and young adults of color, of myself, but I also need to be asking it of those who I collaborate with, so that we're not doing this work just as sort of individuals who feel particularly called or passionate, but that we're inviting others into that. So I just want to pause and say that for me, this feels like a very hard ask. Like, it is not easy to shift the questions. It's easy to add on a unit or to add in a reading. but my experience is that we have to go to the roots and we have to go to the questions. I think about in my own life, if I am reading primarily white authors, that is who, through no fault of my own, I will reference when I'm leading worship or when I'm having a pastoral care conversation with a youth. At the times in my life where I have personally had fewer relationships with adults of color, it's been hard for me to have a sense of what it means to be a person of color in 2015 outside of my own experience. So I know that these are big things. These are about our lives and our relationships. And I think that the only way we will change the outcomes, we will change where we're at, is if we go deep and dig deep into the questions and into where we're rooted and where our networks are. All right, let's move on to the third piece. So one of the other takeaways of the Multicultural Ministries Sharing Project was that the highest priority for UUs of color was building multicultural community. And belonging, we can go to the next slide, is clearly key for youth and young adults. It is hard to feel at one with the great abiding love or the spirit of the universe if you do not feel like you have a place where you belong, or you feel like you're holding your racial or ethnic identity alone in your spiritual community. So I want to offer 3 ways that folks can feel connected, knowing that for youths of color, that connection sometimes needs to take different forms than it does for white UUs. So one way is through media. I just threw up some of my favorite both UU voices of color and also some of my favorite stories and books by other folks of color who take up these questions about identity. And maybe it's books, maybe it's video, maybe it's article, maybe it's blog posts. One thing I've learned is to not underestimate the power of a youth or a young adult being able to see some aspect of their story reflected outside of themselves. I was in college before I met someone else who was half Asian and half white, who was not my brother. And it was a transformative experience to be in a room of half Asian, half white folks in college. And it changed my core and how I feel in the world. And we may not be able to provide that room full of folks that have a particular shared identity, but we can point people in the direction of voices that may help them feel more connected. All right. Another way to connect, as we probably know, is through national and sometimes now to regional gatherings of UUs of color. So lifting up Multicultural Leadership School, which is a national program for UU youth and young adults of color. Gatherings at General Assembly. This is a picture from the Asian Pacific Islander gathering at GA a couple years ago. This year there will be a lunch for UU youth of color that's free, facilitated by some awesome folks, and a space for young adults of color to gather formally, and then also an offsite gathering that's more of a social gathering. And then, because clearly resources also play a role in this, I also want to lift up that there are monthly virtual gatherings for UUs of color, which can include youth and young adults, that Jessica York helps convene. And the link to that, I think, is somewhere in our resources. So that can also be a resource. And then the third way to connect that I want to highlight is through partnership. This is a photo of the UU Urban Ministries Roxbury Youth Program partnering with the Winchester Youth Group. This is all happening in the Boston area. So a secular group of mostly young people of color, mostly low-income young people, coming together with a primarily white UU youth group, mostly middle and higher income, to work on food justice together for a week. So we can also look outside of our UU communities to see where we might build multiracial community. I just want to share two things that I feel really passionate about that have to do with building multiracial community. Sometimes I think we imagine that what justice making and multiracial community look like are the same. And though those things are inextricably linked, they can look very different. So going to volunteer at a soup kitchen or going to lobby on immigration justice, the way that looks, the opportunities that are there for building meaningful relationships across difference, that might look very different than having folks from a congregation attend a fundraiser hosted by a community organization that works on Asian women's health, or attending a Men Who Cook event that's hosted by a local Black fraternity. So what I want to highlight is that we can build multiracial community outside of our justice-making work. It's awesome when they happen at the same time, and we don't have to limit ourselves to just connecting across difference around justice issues, because there are powerful ways to build community, whether it's based around shared interests outside of justice or based around local communities that have proximity in common, or whatever it may be. And I think we can go to the next slide. So this is kind of a lie. Sometimes justice making does equal multiracial community, but not always. They can look differently as well. And then the other piece is that sometimes in our dominant white culture, conversations about race and justice are seen solely as prophetic. But that for many youth and young adults of color, what might be seen as prophetic by the dominant white culture can in fact be very, very pastoral. So honoring Black lives lost to police violence in a prayer and worship might feel like justice work or prophetic work to white folks. But for a person of color might feel very pastoral, like I'm being seen as a whole person, a person who might experience profiling or who fears for the safety of my family or myself. So I just want to lift up those two pieces. And then let's go to the next piece. So we talked a little bit about figuring out where we are as a movement. Another piece that is really key is to figure out where we are as individuals. And it's okay if we feel like we have a lot of skills yet to gain in this area. Let's be real that there are ways to reach out to UU youth and young adults of color that can feel at best awkward or ineffective, and at worst painful or harmful. Cultural appropriation is real and tricky. Trying to offer someone a resource when you don't know exactly how they identify or what their identity story is can be very complicated. And I think the best way to move forward is to figure out, can you trust your gut on this stuff? And it's okay if you're in a learning place where you feel like maybe you can't. And the key there is to find folks to model off of and learn from, and to ask those people if they're willing to offer coaching and support. So I just threw up on the slide a few of my favorite ways to offer a resource to someone without assuming. So you can just say, I don't know how you identify. Here's a resource you might find helpful. And they can say, this is amazing, or like, totally no, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a big fan of like, let me know if this fits. Because part of this is about how do we make ourselves available and connect folks to resources without assuming. All right, and then the last piece that I want to lift up is that this work, particularly of putting UU youth and young adults of color at the center in terms of focusing on their spiritual growth, that is good for everyone. It's good for white UUs, it's good for white youth, white young adults. And similarly, getting grounded in our identity and doing identity development work, getting connected to our ancestors, figuring out how our racial and ethnic identities connect to our spiritual lives, that is good for white UUs as well. So I think I just picked like a photo that I thought talked about white identity development. And then, so those are some of the insights that I wanted to share. And then I just want to quickly talk through some of the resources, and these slides will be available because they have links in them. But for folks who want to go deeper or want to share with people in your staff group or other people you're doing ministry with, the Multicultural Ministry Sharing Project is the one that I pulled some data from. There's also something called the Mosaic Project Report, which here that is, which was done in 2009 and looks particularly at ministry with UU youth of color and makes some recommendations out of that. And then I pulled some things around identity formation, and some of these workshops are more focused on racial justice than on spiritual development, but have some neat and helpful things. And then let's see, what else did we put up there? So I broke that down into youth and young adults. And then some UU voices of color that are published in ways that it's easy to like hand someone a book. And then I just pulled two pieces about multicultural leadership that for folks who are interested in that might be helpful. And then I think the last two are just sort of, I brain dumped some books for youth and young adults that talk about identity across a wide spectrum. And then some musical pieces, because I think part of the exciting threshold that we're on is how do we not just talk about this stuff, but how do we actually integrate it into our spiritual lives?